Forget libertarians. We need librarians. I mean, this is, in essence, if I were to think about the future of libraries, if I were to think about how we're going to respond to the meteoric rise of AI, well, I kept thinking, where have we spent the last 20, 30 years of internet and organizing information? It's been a very libertarian focus. And maybe as a society, we need to start empowering and embracing a librarian focus on the internet. Now, granted, I still do want to talk about AI. I want to talk about the digital divide, and in particular, center that into the future of libraries. But in order to do so, I kind of feel that we need to take a bit of a journey today, a bit of a narrative journey into both understanding technology, but also understanding where technology resides in an increasingly complicated, an increasingly confused, an increasingly muddied society, especially when it comes to our informational health. Now, anytime I start a presentation, I have to address what it means to be a futurist or, where my bona fides or credentials are. And I appreciate Brandon giving me that very generous introduction. But I sort of feel that the most appropriate place for us to start our journey today is to really look at authority. And when I say authority, I mean who we trust, who we listen to, where we get our worldview from, where our morals or values are derived from. And I've been arguing almost for 30 years now that the primary impact of the internet has been to transform our relationship with authority. Now, if you look at the scholarly literature, they talk about a shift from institutional authority to something called cognitive authority. And while I'm sort of hesitant to say a cognitive authority is a subject expert, I think the most powerful examples of cognitive authorities in our world are Mr. Beast or the Kardashians, or if you're young enough, Skibbity Toilet, and that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, President Joe Biden. These are not necessarily the most trusted authorities in our world. Instead, we're turning to new kinds of authorities, cognitive authorities. And a great example of this is if you think about our media. I'm old enough to remember that the only people who would appear on CBC, the only people who would be quoted in the Globe and Mail were those who had institutional authority. Presidents, executive directors, ministers, teachers, police. These were all authorities who had been vetted by an organization and therefore had earned that trust, and that's why they were put on the very powerful, privileged stage that is the media. And yet, if you look at the media today, any fool with a Twitter account, or should I say any fool with a TikTok account, is going to appear in the media, be quoted as an expert, merely because they have signal amidst the noise. 8 years ago, I used to be able to make the joke that any idiot with a Twitter account can become president of the United States. And as scary as that is, 2 weeks away from a U.S. presidential election where literally fascism is one of the options that people have, it does suggest that our relationship with authority is completely immersed democracy in a crisis, immersed our entire society in a crisis, especially when it comes to information and knowledge, where we get that knowledge and whether that knowledge is valuable, has integrity, applies to us, or is part of a larger manipulative or for-profit scheme. I used to say this 5-10 years ago and people would think I was being alarmist, versus now, unfortunately, especially to a group of librarians, this almost becomes a kind of common sense. But if I've mentioned institutional authority and cognitive authority, well, it's worth remembering that there is a third kind of authority in our society, and that's what we call algorithmic authority. And algorithmic authority speaks to a whole other kind of trust, a whole other kind of decision-making that we all rely upon and at the same time can be very dangerous. I mean, for example, How often do you go to the second page of Google search results because you felt that that first page wasn't trustworthy enough and you wanted to get more of a comparative analysis? Very few people do that. In fact, the most tragic example of algorithmic authority is the concept of death by GPS. This is where someone operating an automobile either drives down a forest road in the middle of winter or perhaps goes on the wrong way on a one-way street. There are, as researchers have demonstrated, unfortunately, a gross number of death by GPS or injury by GPS because the operator of the vehicle did not have the critical thinking skills to say no to the algorithm, right? To defy the algorithm, to think differently. And all of this speaks not just to the role of authority, but more importantly, the critical role of literacy. Now, for a long time, I used to go on stage and say that the internet does not exist, that the internet is just a distraction, a sleight of hand. Now, granted, computers exist, smartphones exist, heck, even the World Wide Web as hypertext transfer protocol operating on ports 80 and 443. It too exists, but the internet is just a metaphor. The internet is just a story we tell ourselves to wrap our heads around the immense technological, political, socio-cultural change that we're experiencing. But the internet itself, well, that doesn't actually exist. It's not a thing. Granted, I can't do that anymore. If I were to get into a philosophical debate with all of you as to whether the internet exists or not, we would have a good time. But the internet does exist, and it exists in a very substantive, very powerful manner for all concerned. So if I were to offer you a definition of what is the internet, I would say that the internet is a great big learning curve, right? There's no finish line to the internet. There's no one could say, okay, I figured it out. What's next? No, every day there's new apps, new services, new large language models that threaten to disrupt and change whatever world, whatever configuration we currently live in. So if you think about the internet as a great big learning curve, well, then your status in society directly correlates to where you are on that learning curve. Think of it as a kind of mountain in the digital landscape that the higher up you are, the more you can see, the greater your perspective. Now, obviously, one's position on that learning curve is a definition of literacy, an application of literacy. And here I'm not putting any prefix in front of the word like digital literacy or technological literacy. No, I mean literacy as we've known it, right? Pattern recognition, the ability to look at letters and words and derive meaning. That skill, that life skill has never been more important as we are subsumed by information, as knowledge, all of the world's knowledge is literally at our fingertips. The question becomes, how do we employ that literacy? How does that literacy become our path to medical care, our path to education, our path to employment, our path to political citizenship and the ability to participate in a democratic society? This is something we've kind of taken for granted, but this is why I'm arguing today that librarians and libraries need to be at the forefront of our society. That we have a particularly difficult problem to tackle, and if we fail, we may likely find ourselves in an authoritarian society ruled by mythology that fundamentally revives the horrors that we've seen in human history. Now, part of the reason I emphasize literacy and the value of librarians in facilitating that literacy is this is me anticipating the rise of artificial intelligence. And as a public speaker, as a futurist, I've been getting paid to talk about artificial intelligence for 2 decades now. And while that's been a lot of fun, it's been an interesting perspective to see how the narrative of AI, the story of AI has changed year after year, even though the technology underpinning it has remained the same. I mean, let's not forget that Jeff Hinton, the so-called godfather of AI, came up with his theories decades ago. We only now have the data and the computational power to actually have this connectionist model of the brain, of cognitive science, produce AI. But the reality is this is still old tech. So what I want to do today, very briefly, is debunk the 3 myths of AI. Because we live in a society right now where most people don't understand artificial intelligence. In fact, artificial intelligence has become this story, almost like a boogeyman, to scare people and to disempower them so that they don't understand this tool. They don't have the literacy to employ this tool and use it for personal empowerment. Instead, often the consequences of mythologies that go unchecked is they become tools for authoritarianism. They become tools for manipulation. So, myth number 1 of AI is the myth of singularity. The idea that at some point in the near future, AI will come alive. It will become sentient and all of a sudden be smarter than us and take over society and see us as an existential threat. To which I say nonsense. If you look at any credible scientist in cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, even computational science, all of them will tell you there is 0 chance of AI becoming alive. We do not understand the human brain. There is no risk of us recreating it in some box. Instead, what we have is an extension of ourself, as Marshall McLuhan would say, a way of taking our thoughts, our ideas, our passions, our emotions, and putting them into media, putting them into machines so we can see their reflection. But anything we perceive as alive is just a shadow of us, right? So if you think about Hollywood, Terminator, 2001, I mean, there's been a litany of movies that have embellished this myth and this fear that all of a sudden artificial general intelligence is going to come alive and be this omnipotent force. Whereas, quite frankly, I just point to the Wizard of Oz, right? The Wizard of Oz long ago got AI right. There'll be this puppet that looks like a god, sounds like a god, but really it's Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk behind the curtain pulling the strings. And if everybody is foolish enough, if there is a lack of literacy and understanding of these tools, then we might believe that new gods have been formed, and behind them are this new clergy that is the monopoly of knowledge on how these tools work. Again, I say nonsense to that. It is a myth, a dangerous myth, one we can easily discard, especially if you're willing to pay attention to scientists whose job it is to research this, and they are not only skeptical, they're outright opposed to the way in which this language disempowers and marginalizes human agency. So let's get to myth number 2, the myth of objectivity. The idea that automated decision-making systems, that AI, once empowered to make decisions, that it will be objective, that it won't be prone to the same human tendencies of emotion and bias and corruption and power, that instead, if we were to empower these algorithms to make these decisions, well, then we'd have a more just society. What a joke. In fact, I'll go even further to argue that there is no such thing as neutral data. All data reflects the bias of who collected that data, which questions were asked, what data points were prioritized, which subjects were subject to that surveillance, and which were privileged to avoid it. Right? There is no such thing as objective data. There is no such thing as objective decision making. All algorithms, all AI are biased. The question is not how is it biased? The question is who is it biased for? Because if I were to tell you that Amazon's algorithm was biased in favor of Amazon, you'd probably nod your head and go, yeah, Jesse, that explains why Amazon is always saying, oh yeah, buy this one, not this one. Or how lots of small businesses find success on Amazon's platform and then finds that Amazon steals their lunch, what they get to a little bit of success, right? Is Facebook's algorithm biased in favor of Facebook? so that it keeps you on the platform longer and shows you Star Wars memes from your youth because that might, from a nostalgia level, keep you connected, right? All platforms have algorithms that are biased in favor of the platforms, which suggests rather than spending time on removing bias, we should be asking ourselves, hey, how can I get an AI that's biased in favor of me? I want an intelligent agent that will vote early and vote often on my behalf. And when I use services online, I want them to reflect my social values. I want them to reflect my intellectual interests and pursuits. Now, if you really want to get into the psychology and the research around how reason and emotion are inseparable, that we as human beings think best when we are emotional, we have our smartest ideas when we are happy, when we are curious, when we are intrigued. So the idea that cognition can be distinct from reason and emotion when instead they're intertwined, that speaks to a completely different vision of AI than we currently have. Now, of course, then there's the third myth of AI. And the third myth of AI, I used to be 100% certain of. And this is the myth of unemployment. The idea that AI all of a sudden is going to steal all of our jobs. But the reality, empirically, is that automation has never led to job loss. There is decades worth of really phenomenal scholarly research that suggests it's usually a range of other factors that result in that job displacement. Globalization, cheaper wages, regulatory issues. But automation does not eliminate jobs, it transforms them. It expands their capacity. It can make them more complicated. It can make them more unpleasant. Right? Ask an Amazon warehouse worker how great it is to be working in an automated warehouse, and they're probably going to tell you a tale of woe. But at the same time, this is where the myth, especially the myth of unemployment, becomes a bit of a tricky pickle. Because the difference between myth and reality is often just belief. So if enough people believe that AI can automate work, and there are a number of employers and managers who currently believe this, well, then it'll come true. Unfortunately, they'll find that the degradation of service, the mistakes that AI make are a problem unto themselves. But this is why we need to be careful about the role of mythology in our society. I am not opposed to mythology. I think mythology and storytelling is kind of innate to the human condition, to what makes us human. But I think we need to question why we have the myths we do and who benefits from those myths. What is the political economic agenda of those myths? And I think that's really important when we recognize the rise of algorithmic authority. And how when we embed more automated decision-making into our society, we need that critical thinking. We need the human being to say, no, you're wrong, AI. And that's where I want to take a little bit of time to talk about hacking, right? Anyone who's interested, you put into Google Jesse Hirsch hacker arrest, and you'll find an interesting story from 1994 when I was one of the first people arrested in Canada for hacking. While I was technically guilty, I did not know at the time how to hack. This was an issue of my brother letting me use his account at the University of Toronto and him not having the authority to let me use his account. But suffice to say, I ended up learning a lot of hacking after that. And it kind of made me realize if we are to assume that literacy is the basis of social status in a technological society, that literacy is your basis of being a citizen, right? If we assume that a citizen is someone who has a certain level of education, information, and responsibility to participate in a democratic society, well, then you kind of have to be a hacker to be a citizen. Because how could you exist in this technologically saturated society and just be obedient and just follow everything the algorithm tells you? You will not develop literacy. You will not develop critical literacy. No, you got to press the buttons. You got to play with all the configurations. You got to break the thing. That's how literacy tends to be developed, at least rapidly, in the technological space. Now, props to all the libraries out there who have embraced the maker revolution and have created maker spaces somehow associated with the library, whether virtually or physically. But let's be honest, that's only going halfway, right? Maker spaces are really sterilized hacker spaces, because all maker spaces had their origins in the world of hacking. And there's reasons why hacking has been criminalized, has been stigmatized, when it is, in essence, the basis of citizenry, the basis of literacy in a technologically saturated society. Now, I'm not in favor of criminality. I'm in favor of knowledge. I'm in favor of science. I'm in favor of experimentation, and that's what ethical hackers do. That's what community hackers do. And that's why it's important to remember that the core definition of hacking is lying to machines. And I'm here to tell you today that our democracy depends on our ability to lie to machines. Now, okay, maybe you're the kind of person who really believes in truth and objectivity, and you're like, oh no, Jesse, I could never lie. All right, before I get into why you should lie, allow me to give you a halfway point, and that's defiance. You should defy the algorithms you use. You should defy the automated decision makers that you employ. Why should you defy them? Because it makes you smarter. I'll offer you my classic example. So I live in Almont, Mississippi Mills, just outside of Ottawa near Carleton Place. But my family's in Toronto. I have a lot of business in Toronto, so I drive often. I love Google Maps. I love Google Maps traffic predictions. I love Google Maps telling me about the speed traps. But the best way to make Google Maps work for you is to defy it. When it tells you to turn left, turn right. When it tells you to take the 401, no, take Highway 7. Right? And what's interesting is that when you defy what the algorithm wants you to do, its feelings aren't hurt. It doesn't get angry with you. It doesn't, withdraw and refuse to offer services. No, it adapts. It changes to your interests. It forms to your agenda and your preferences. Because by default, it's going to follow its biases and its agenda. But as soon as you start defying it, as soon as you start interacting with it in a more adversarial or at least hacker ethic, then all of a sudden the algorithm starts working for you. And this is one of the reasons that when we think about algorithmic authority, we really need to demystify, debunk the way these tools work so that people use them as tools and not think of them as magical devices that they can't understand, but instead bend and adapt and really push these tools to their limits so that you have the opportunity to really not just understand how they work, but to understand the philosophy, the ethics, the impact behind it. And this is why the concept of the digital divide is still so relevant today. I mean, the benefit, the positive aspect of the pandemic was that it induced digital transformation. It forced society to take remote medicine, remote education, remote work, and deal with it seriously. And that also forced the provincial government, the federal government, even some municipalities to really commit to high-speed, affordable bandwidth, broadband. I'm a big fan of fiber optics. I think we need fiber all throughout the province. That's a totally separate issue, which if anyone wants to bring it up in the Q&A, we can get into. But the digital divide is not connectivity. The digital divide is intellectual. The digital divide is about literacy. And where the research around digital divides has really evolved is it comes down to not sort of what we have with the application or the connectivity around the application, but how we use it. And social media is a great example, because if we're honest with ourselves, social media is the most powerful learning technology ever invented by humanity. But it's also the most dangerous technology ever invented by humanity, right? And the difference is literacy. On the one hand, and take TikTok as an example, because I absolutely love TikTok. And, you know, when I've sort of got the Jesse Hirsch here, this is not, it used to be me encouraging you to go onto Twitter and tell me how much of an idiot I am. Now it's TikTok. It's me encouraging you to go onto TikTok and tell me how much of an idiot I am. And allow me to take a moment to shout out the Bracebridge Public Library. I love what you guys are doing on TikTok. If there are any smaller library systems who are wondering, hey, what can we do on TikTok? Go check out what Bracebridge is doing on TikTok. I'm really quite impressed. But my point here is it all comes down to intent. It all comes down to the focus of the user. I wouldn't surprise you to learn that I do not use TikTok to lip sync and do dancing. I use TikTok as an intelligence tool. I use TikTok as a research tool. It allows me to get rapid, relevant, accurate, and valuable information, knowledge, and intelligence on any subject I want when I want it. It allows me to connect to news, politics, and world events in a way that has never been anywhere close to as powerful as to what the TikTok algorithm offers, partly because I have the literacy to know how to train that TikTok algorithm, how to make it work for me. But at the same time, there's lots of people who are addicted to TikTok, who, you know, TikTok is almost a narcotic for them because of the way it triggers their dopamine. And here we see the difference between entertainment and education. Fundamentally, there is no difference. It's all in the eyes of the beholder. So if you have the discipline, the curiosity, the intellectual drive that I do, well, then TikTok is going to be the most powerful informational tool that has existed to date. But at the same time, if you don't have that literacy, if you don't have that wherewithal, if you don't have that focus, then TikTok will be a source of terrible disinformation, manipulative information, and sheer distraction. All right, so that's the issue. Is it self-directed learning, or is it self-distracted opiates and education? I'm not saying that both in proper measure are not okay. I use TikTok for pleasure too, but this is why the digital divide is so important. We are being given the tools that are both so incredibly powerful and incredibly intoxicating, incredibly empowering and incredibly distracting and disempowering. And the difference fundamentally has to do with how we shape people's experience, how we empower them with the critical thinking skills, the literacy frame to make that happen. And this is why, to go back to my original title screen, I say forget the libertarians. We need librarians, right? This whole idea that the internet can be left to its own, that it doesn't need, social stewardship. It doesn't need professionals whose job is to think about literacy, to think about how information is organized, to help people with self-directed education. We need a radical rethink of how we support internet in communities and how we address the digital divide. And I've got a crazy solution. But before I offer it, I need to take a little sip of my water. And as a personal plug this morning, as I was thinking about this forget libertarians, we need librarians, I posted a rant on that very subject on LinkedIn. So if you want to go to my LinkedIn and connect, you'll find a nice little rant about that. But as I mentioned, even though I spent my early childhood just south of North Bay, outside of Powassan, actually, among some crazy hippie freaks who were dodging the Vietnam War and, trying to start their own society in the Northern Ontario bush, at some point they decided, okay, time to go back to school to Toronto, and they dragged my young butt to the city. And I lived in Toronto for, 30 years. And then I realized, no, I got to get out of there. So I bought a nice little farm here on Wolf Grove Road in Mississippi Mills. And that's when I realized small communities have volunteer firefighting services. And granted, in the city, police, firefighting, we kind of take it for granted. But I was blown away by volunteer firefighting services. Both the model of it, but also the social status it had within the community. Like, if you're a volunteer firefighter, you got that sticker on your car, you're wearing the hat, you know, you're the big Joe walking in the grocery store because it was like, oh, look at him. He's volunteering with the firefighter service. And I'm not disrespecting. I think it's pretty cool. But the analogy I thought was, wow, what about a volunteer internet service? What if you had the same idea, right? Because small communities cannot afford a very large firefighting service, but they also don't want their community to burn down. Well, don't you know it? The internet is burning your community down, whether you know it or not. Do you see a lot of people with their Fornicate Trudeau flags? Do you see a lot of people promoting conspiracy theories? Well, maybe that's because your community is burning down informationally, and we need a volunteer internet service. So with the volunteer firefighters, they've got one or two paid professionals, the chief, maybe the deputy chief, and everything else is largely training. I mean, don't get me wrong, they do have to put out fires now and then, but you don't want a bunch of volunteers who know nothing about fighting fires showing up like heroes at an emergency. No. The core essence of volunteer firefighting services is training. Incentivizing volunteers to go through training, to learn that training, so that they can then be on call, so that when a fire happens, they can go put it out. So why couldn't we take the same approach to the internet? Right? We got a couple of paid staff called librarians, and then we could have a volunteer force, you know, the nerds, the nerd council, the hackers of the community, who all come together on a regular basis for training, to learn about large language models, to learn about how AI and video manipulation is becoming a thing, to talk about fiber optic connectivity and which parts of the community we should be running fiber to, and maybe creating an inventory of all the internet companies that are operating out of people's homes in the community and who happens to have internet expertise and whether they could be doing workshops at the library or workshops online via Zoom. If you think about it, the model of volunteer firefighting services could be translated almost entirely to a literacy operation, a connectivity operation, an internet economic development operation. It would vary community to community, right? Because Killaloe has different needs than, say, Eganville has different needs than, say, Sioux Lookout. But nonetheless, why are we assuming that the internet's just going to be figured out on its own? Why are we taking the most powerful technology that has emerged in my lifetime and we're just allowing people to use it, you know, as if they're not going to harm themselves, as if there's not going to be any social, economic, or political consequences from allowing everyone to use these powerful tools without any guidance, without any facilitation, without any hand-holding. And I think we can all see the consequences of that. And that is the dominance of conspiracy in our culture. I mean, I used to sort of laugh and say, we're in a golden era of conspiracy. But then people got the wrong idea from that. They thought that I was promoting conspiracy as a good thing, which I'm not. But I have to acknowledge that the conspiracists, almost day after day, are winning. I mean, let's take the pandemic, for example. Thank you very much for having a remote event. I'm still very COVID paranoid, so whenever anyone hires me for an in-person event, I pretty much have to plan for 2 weeks of illness after it. But the pandemic has not ended. COVID is still an active threat. And if you go to anyone on the street or anyone who walks into your library and you ask them, what is COVID? What is the risk of COVID? Why should we be concerned about COVID? They are not going to give you an answer that matches science. They are going to give you an answer that is conspiracy, right? Empirically, the conspiracists won the pandemic. And that's one of the reasons why most people think the pandemic is over. And they still speak about the pandemic in past tense. That's a ticking time bomb, right? You wonder why our healthcare system in Ontario is bursting at the seams. It's because we're still in a pandemic. Now, let's put that aside And let's talk about climate change. Now, granted, I think here in Ontario, hopefully, we're a little more enlightened about the science around climate change. But it was rather tragic and also fascinating to watch Hurricane Helene hit western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee recently. The way it absolutely devastated mountainous communities in the Appalachians. And there were two parts of that I found extremely disturbing. The first was everyone saying we could never imagine this happening here. And I don't fault them for that, but I could. And the reason I could is I know what an atmospheric river is. I've been watching what's happening in British Columbia with their atmospheric rivers, and I've been very conscious of the fact that mountainous communities are actually incredibly vulnerable to climate change. The fact that this community couldn't even conceive of it is not their fault, although it is the fault of their elected leaders who are conveniently ignoring climate change. But then let's talk about what happened after. Because as hurricane relief, as emergency responders tried to get to their communities, there were militias actively trying to hunt them and run them out of their communities based on disinformation and fears induced from conspiracy. So what's going to happen is we start experiencing climate catastrophe and the conspiracies around climate start gaining traction, right? There was an elected member of Congress, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene, who actively believes that the government controls the weather. She's promoting this actively. So again, we as a society are under great risk of an authoritarian regime that uses conspiracy to manipulate and scare people, and they're using the internet and algorithmic authority to make it happen. Who's going to stop that? Politicians? No. Academics? No. Influencers on the internet? No. Librarians? Yeah, that's it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure you're looking around going, us? Us? But the premier, he prefers Tim Hortons to libraries. What are we going to do? I know. I wish you had more resources. I wish you had more capability. I wish democracy as we know it, sanity as we know it, did not rest upon librarians. But here we are. That's kind of what's going on. And that's why I'm suggesting maybe we need to be looking at volunteer firefighting services and to make an equivalent organized through libraries by librarians in which we start focusing on community literacy ASAP. We start focusing on community internet empowerment ASAP. We start helping people develop AI skills and learn how to engage with AI models, whether large language models, whether image models, whether data-based models. It is so accessible. Anybody without computer programming can now actually start playing with this technology in very powerful ways, but nobody knows that. And there's no marketing department that's going to tell them. There's no elected leaders who are going to tell them. It's librarians. Like, honestly, that's it. You know, I wish that I was the guy coming with like, here's how you're going to make banks full of money to support library services. No, I think part of what I'm doing today is trying to give you the intellectual ammunition to make the argument for libraries, to develop community initiatives bootstrapped with very minimal to no resources, so you can not only make the case for libraries, you can become indispensable in your communities as the lifeblood of the literacy and economic development that happens in those communities. So then all of a sudden, because you're a pillar, and you already all are a pillar, but because you become a crucial, obvious, indispensable pillar, that's when the resources start flowing back. Now, I hopefully have left a lot of time for questions and answers and debate, but I want to end on this last notion of futurism and what it means to be a futurist. Because I've always been a reluctant futurist. I mean, a couple of decades ago, I used to think that futurists were full of it. And then I found out how much money futurists made, and I became a futurist. But I still think that futurists are full of it, right? There is no future. We only live in today. and there's no way to predict the future. But what I like about futurism, and in particular the concept of inclusive futurism, is that everyone has their own future. And we should be empowering people to see themselves as futurists. Now, I'm a relatively novice farmer. I've been farming now for about 6 years. But the first thing I discovered upon becoming a farmer is that all farmers are futurists. Because if you're a farmer, you have to think about the future. You have to think about the growing season. You have to think of your livestock. And if you're smart, you're certainly thinking about climate change and climate volatility. But I think librarians, like farmers, are also inherently futurists, right? There's a certain element of being a librarian that's not just about being curious, but that actually puts you a little bit ahead of everyone else. Like the same way that our friends in Newfoundland are literally an hour and a half in the future, I kind of feel that librarians are a few days, a few months, maybe even a few years in the future, but you guys don't realize it, right? You're sort of stuck in the present. You're stuck in the moment of the day-to-day operations of the library and dealing with your patrons, versus I would encourage you to see the future as a kind of Trojan horse. So I keep bringing this model of hackers and authorities and the digital divide and how we need a kind of, volunteer internet force or a volunteer nerd cooperative. But maybe futurist is the right lens. So instead of the volunteer firefighting services, maybe it's the volunteer future services. And part of what the library is offering is a way for people to organize around the future, which includes AI, which includes the internet, which includes technology, which includes knowledge and the knowledge economy. But the future allows us to be inclusive without being too political. It allows us to be accessible, but at the same time allow stupid questions and allow different debates and ideas around ethics of AI, around the ethics of technology. So I hope I've been able to change the way that you think about technology, change the way that you think about your role as a librarian, and hopefully embrace this idea that we need to forget the libertarians. We need more librarians in order to address the issues and the challenges that we face as a society. So I noticed a couple of questions have already come in, although I will take a quick moment here to... Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. This is one of the hard parts about doing a remote event, is it's hard to acknowledge the kind of end, and I appreciate that. Thank you.